Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest in our series of online discussions in our Friday Insights Online that the National Art Museum are running. Thanks very much for joining us. Hello, I'm looking with interest about everyone chipping in with where they're from. Kevin, you're still winning as being the furthest away, but one of these days someone will beat you. We'll probably get someone, I don't know, from either the very southern tip of Otago or something like that, or even further. Actually, know what's even further away than New Zealand? Maybe Fiji. Have you crossed the date line by the time you're in Fiji? Maybe. But anyway, kia ora to you, Kevin. Always good to have you with us. Everybody else, thank you. It's so nice to see you. We're a real treat today. There's something really exciting about this. Something slightly different from our usual sort of pure military history fair, but something that's going to be fascinating all the same. I can see how many people have joined, how many questions are coming already, that you guys all feel the same. I'm really pleased that today we are being joined by Professor Rory Cormac, who's an intelligence specialist, who's written a fantastic book. Hopefully some of you guys saw the documentary that was out over the weekend as well. If you haven't, it's still available on Catch Up on Channel 4, so please do so. And obviously, as we go through, please ask the question function, keep things going in the chat. And for those of you absolutely inspired by what we're talking about and want to learn more, if you look at the green bar directly below me here, you will see that if you click through on that link and use that unique code, you will get 30% off Rory's book, which I absolutely recommend that you do. But not until we finish speaking, of course. You can wait that until the end to go through and do that. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, please bear with us if we do have any technical issues. We are doing our best, but we're doing this from home, and so it might not be quite as smooth as we'd really like it to be, but we think we're going to get there. For those of you who are maybe joining in or come a little bit late or interested in watching this back, if you follow the exact same link you used to get here, after the broadcast has ended, it's converted into a replay and you'll be able to watch it pretty much instantly. So you'll be able to enjoy this again and again. Do also feel free to flip back through some of the back catalogue as well as some of the other talks too, if you've got a moment or you're having a cup of coffee later on this afternoon. But without further ado, I think we'll jump into things because we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. There's a lot of questions coming up, and there's some really fascinating stuff to get into. So Rory, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to welcome you. And I think what I'll kick off with the first question, which I'm sure a lot of people share as well, is can we talk about the sources that you use? You know, because obviously when you do like secret things, and it almost sounds counterintuitive to talk about secrecy when you're reading things that are being published or being hidden in archives. But if we talk about the sources that you use, you know, how do you find them? Are you the first person to look at some of these? Talk to us a little bit about your research process.
Of course, and thanks for having me. And hello, everybody. I've never broadcasted from my spare bedroom before, but here we go. The sources is interesting because on the downside, as many of you will know, SIS, GCHQ, Special Forces records are all classified. There are some SIS ones from the war in the very, very early Cold War, but generally it's a blanket ban. So therefore, as historians, we have to be quite creative, and we know that there's much more out there than people realise. If you start to dig around a little bit, you start to look in what we might call parallel files, then you can trace little breadcrumb trails. You can start to see, well, if I can't get the MI6 report, who else might have wanted to read the MI6 report, who might not be under such scrutiny from the government weeders? And so you can start to put little fragments together. And I'll give you an example. There was some really interesting stuff that I found out about a super top secret MI6 slush fund, essentially, which they used to bribe Middle Eastern leaders in the 1950s. Incredibly secret. No one had written or stumbled upon this before. In fact, it was so secret, even the Prime Minister did not know about it. Even the Foreign Secretary did not know about it. Even the MI6 financial director did not know about this particular slush fund. And I stumbled upon these files in Treasury papers, because when the wartime chief of SIS, Stuart Mingens, retired in 1952, he left quite a dramatic inheritance. He said, by the way, I've got this super secret slush fund, which I've been using to bribe Middle Eastern leaders. It's got about £1 million in it. And this was uncovered, I uncovered it in Treasury files. And you can see then the trail of all the different ministers reacting with shock and a bit of glee. Britain's very skint, and to have an unofficial fund was quite welcome. And in those same Treasury papers, we get discussions of covert operations, which are classified elsewhere, and their cost. but it's still very fragmented. And the job of the historian, it's a challenge, but it's also great fun, is to stitch these fragments together. So, for example, in those Treasury papers, there was one reference to something called Operation Razzle, which I'd never heard of before. I've never seen it written down before. It cost £500,000 or whatever. And next to it, someone had written in very faint pencil marks 4 words. They'd written Yemen, Imam dying, and friends. Yemen is obvious. The Imam of Yemen was an adversary of us at the time because he opposed British position in Aden. His health, we weren't sure about his health. There were question marks about it. Friends, many of you will know, is a euphemism for MI6 in the British establishment, and that's all we had to go on. So you get these little snippets, and it's great fun trying to stitch them together. It's still quite mysterious. The second area where we can turn to try and find some of this stuff is the private papers of people involved, because a lot of this material is redacted in the National Archives, but there are some absolute gems lying in the private papers of former SOE people, of former diplomats, and I'll just give a brief example here as well. There are the private papers of Evelyn Shuckburgh, who was the Foreign Office Middle East Supremo in the 1950s, are lying in Birmingham, in the Cadbury Library in Birmingham. And in it, there is a discussion that he had with the Queen about covert operations, which is something you would never in a million years find in the National Archives down at Kew. And Shuckburgh is at the palace. He's just finished having lunch with the Queen, and they're talking about Jordan. They're alluding to a British propaganda campaign in Jordan, and they're worried about the malicious influence of the young king's uncle. And Shuckburgh records in his papers that the Queen says, and I quote, that she was surprised nobody had found means of putting something in his coffee. It was a joke, but you would never see that written down in the National Archives. And Shuckburgh replies to the Queen. He replies, he thinks it's a good idea, Your Majesty, which ought to be applied to a number of people across the Middle East. And he then recalls that he'd wanted to tell her that her comment was dangerously like a remark famously made by her predecessor, King Henry II, when he famously said, well, no one rid me of this meddlesome priest. But Shuckburgh bottled it essentially and nodded instead as his cigarette that he was hiding behind his back was burning smaller and smaller and starting to burn his hand. So you get these great little snippets and insights in private papers as well. So even though there's a blanket ban on SIS and Special Forces, there's still loads of material for entrepreneurial historians to go and track down.
I mean, that's amazing. It must be so much fun to discover like the real human personalities behind some of this stuff as well, you know, to actually find out what these people they found funny, they would crack jokes about.
Yeah, it's great. And the National Archives stuff only gives you it's brilliant what we are able to find, but it only kind of gives you the skeleton of what was going on, the committees. Now, I'm a massive committee nerd, and I won't bore everyone with various committees for covert action, but that's what you get in the National Archives. You then have to move away to private papers and to talking to people to get a sense of who these people are. And I think when we write books based purely on redacted material, particularly that which is held centrally, there's a danger of overplaying committees and forgetting about the personalities. And there were some, quite frankly, maverick personalities at play here. There was a kind of old boys network of special operations executive veterans who frankly didn't want to retire at the end of the Second World War. And every single British operation, covert operation, from 1945 until the mid-1970s, really, the same names were popping up. Most famously among them was Julian Amery, who obviously served in Albania during World War II, and was then, almost by the 1950s, a kind of unofficial minister for covert action, flying around the globe, doing dodgy deals and meeting various rebel groups. So you see this small network, and those characters, I think, are really, really interesting.
I mean, I've got to ask as well, was there anything that, you weren't allowed to write about, that you weren't allowed to look at, that maybe you looked at and then someone sort of said, well, you really can't say these sorts of things? I guess a question is a great way to actually get around someone putting an embargo on you writing something.
Well, the book is based on declassified sources, so we don't have that problem of I've never wanted to be an official historian, because then you get access to the closed stuff, which I think sounds really exciting. I'm desperate to see this closed stuff, but then once you've seen the closed stuff, it's difficult to then go back again and have to go through legal classification reviews, approval from the authorities. So I've deliberately kept it all very declassified. That said, we do interviews with people as well, off the record interviews, which helps me interpret the declassified archival records. But there were one or two things which the very thorough lawyers for the press insisted that I take out, which I don't think I should probably repeat here.
And in terms of those sources, I mean, you mentioned that local, the local papers and the local archives and that sort of thing. I mean, how far ranging did you go? I mean, did you find yourself in a tiny archive and buried in I don't know, small town USA or something like that, which you never thought you might get to? Or you talked about Q obviously, but how far did you range in finding the sources for this?
I have some fantastic memories of driving down Tornado Alley in the US. With tornado warnings coming over the radio as I was fleeing one of the small presidential archives. One of the great, it's a source of frustration, but it's also a great opportunity, is that the American presidential archives are decentralized across the whole of the states. So instead of just rocking up to your archival supermarket, essentially, you have to go to small town Kansas, you have to go to small town Missouri, and then on a slightly more exciting end of the scale, the Reagan archive, which I consulted, is in California, just outside LA. So it's a hard life. The historian's archival trail is a source of great adventure.
Yeah, I bet. So I've noticed in the chat that Anthony's written Moscow was an experience, and I bet there's a cracking story behind there. So perhaps we should be talking to him about a little bit later on. Looking back to moving back to the book, and your story begins in 1945 and the aftermath of the Second World War. Can you tell us a little bit more about the battle between the Foreign Office and the military? When it came to this evolving Cold War, the ever freezing relations between the British and the Soviets. What kind of conflicts were going on there about the idea of covert action?
There was so much tension between the military and the Foreign Office in the aftermath of World War II, and as the Cold War starts to become more solidified. Because after World War II, there's almost a 2 or 3 year period where the Cold War hasn't really started yet, and Russia, we should remember, was an ally during World War II. And so there are certain people in the Foreign Office saying, are we sure it's going to be quite so bad? And the military, in this sense, were right. It did become bad, but they were bruised because they wanted to take control of covert operations at the end of World War II, and they saw the burgeoning Cold War as still a form of conflict, even though there was no shooting. They saw it as a form of conflict. They didn't like the idea that the Foreign Office had managed to win the Whitehall battle and secure a veto over covert operations. They saw the Foreign Office as being very wet and timid when it came to covert operations abroad. And they were pushing for a global political warfare plan from as early as 1947. The chiefs of staff were arguing that Britain should be doing bribery, kidnapping. The quote from one of the chiefs of staff was, "We should be doing anything short of assassination, frankly." And the Foreign Office replied by creating what was called the Information Research Department, which many of you will know was Britain's propaganda wing, essentially, out of the Foreign Office. And the military said, well, this is very well and good, but it's just a bit of grey propaganda. It's a bit wet. It's a bit timid. Where's the bribery? Where's the sabotage? And they're pushing for more stuff. And eventually, under great pressure from the military, the Foreign Office asked the chief of MI6 to come up with almost a list of things that MI6 could do. And they called it C's list. And it was one of the most dramatic documents I've ever had the pleasure of reading in the British archives. And it gives a list which starts off with black propaganda and lies. It then talks about potentially using stink bombs to disrupt Communist Party meetings. It then moves through to sabotage, to kidnapping, to arson, and eventually you see the word liquidation. Now, believe me, you very, very rarely see the word liquidation written down in the British State Archives. Now, Mingers and SIS weren't recommending liquidation. They were trying, in a sense, to appease the military and give the military a sense that the Foreign Office were taking this seriously. And you see covert action developing almost through a compromise of military pressure and Foreign Office hesitance. And what we see over the next 20 years or so is a really fascinating and quite farcical pattern where the Foreign Office will create some sort of mechanism to scrutinize and authorize covert action. They'll keep it secret from the military because they don't want the military involved. Somehow the military get wind of these super secret committees and insist on a seat. The Foreign Office say, okay, you can have a seat, let's talk about overthrowing Albania or whatever. And then the Foreign Office create another committee, and committee one becomes almost like a front committee where the chiefs of staff can rant and rave and vent their frustrations and feel like they're having an input into Britain's covert operations. Meanwhile, the diplomats, through fancy bureaucratic footwork, are next door making the real decisions. And then when the military find out about that committee, the pattern repeats itself over about 20 years. And it's great fun seeing the bureaucratic intrigue down the corridors of Whitehall as the Foreign Office tries to outmaneuver the much more hawkish military. There was only one example that I came across where the Foreign Office were much more keen to launch a covert operation than the military, and actually had to lobby the MOD to agree to it. And that was 1970 and the coup in Oman, where the Foreign Office wanted to overthrow the leader in favor of his son because the leader was waging a counterinsurgency against rebels very, very poorly, and Britain thought that his son would be better. And the military were very worried about this because a lot of the forces inside Oman were seconded from the UK, and the military were very concerned that if seconded military personnel were used in a coup, it would almost fatally undermine the standing of other seconded forces around the world. And the Foreign Office had to lobby the military very hard to allow British citizens to become engaged in this coup, and promised that it would be utterly deniable and not at all traceable back to Britain. But apart from that, it was very much a pattern of the military lobbying for covert action and the Foreign Office doing it a little bit more cautiously.
I mean, with all that, it sounds amazing that anyone had any, effort or strength or even time left to fight the Cold War or anything else if they're trying to dodge the military. I mean, were there flashpoints like I'm thinking about, with Philby and Burgess and stuff, where the military really, sort of tried to seize back control with this element of saying, well, your way's not working or anything like that?
The military, they didn't just use the Cambridge 5 stuff. They used anything to try and seize back control. As late as this second half of the 60s, if I remember correctly, they're still trying to come up with schemes to bring special operations back inside the Ministry of Defence. The Philby stuff was actually more impactful on the American relationship, because obviously we can't understand British covert action without understanding American covert action, because quite often they work together. Sometimes they competed. Actually, there was a lot of competition. The relationship was very pragmatic, more pragmatic than people realised. There was a lot of covert competition between the two sides, and Philby was a flashpoint where the Americans were using it as an excuse to cut the Brits out of various covert operations. Even as early as the Albania operation in the late 1940s, the Americans are not letting MI6 into some of the planning meetings because they've heard rumours about the Cambridge 5 after Burgess, after McLean, And that did have quite an important impact on the US-UK covert action relationship.
Just on the subject of the US, there, obviously the CIA is quite a different beast to MI6 and that sort of thing. Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between MI6 Special Forces and how that compares to some of the American organizations?
You're right, it's completely different because MI6 has never had any kind of comparable kinetic capability like the CIA or even like the French. There's no paramilitary wing to SIS, and therefore since the end of the Second World War they've had to work very closely with special forces. And in America you have this very rigid distinction between covert action, which is done by the CIA, including by its paramilitary wing, versus special military operations, which are done in wartime or anticipated wartime. And they're different, they're distinct, they have different authorization, different oversight procedures. Britain is much more flexible, much more blurred, and that's partly because MI6 has to work very closely with special forces. So from the late 1940s, MI6 used a lot of ex-SOE personnel in places like Iran, the first Iranian covert operation, which was 1946-7, if I remember correctly, and more famously in Albania. You see the ex-SOE types who are leading the charge here. And this pattern continued through until the War on Terror, really, where nowadays there is a special forces team embedded inside MI6 HQ, working closely together and able to act very quickly on intelligence. It's a close relationship. The problem arises when the covert action becomes bigger than a paramilitary special operation. It's when it starts to become a secret war, if that's not too much of an oxymoron, because then it needs broader military planning. You can't just co-opt special forces. And that's when the biggest fights between the military and SIS and the Foreign Office broke out, when in places like Indonesia in the 1960s, in Yemen in the 1960s, in Oman in the 1970s, when these are big operations requiring big logistics and planning, that's when the tension really starts to kick in.
I mean, in the book, you really don't pull any punches when it comes to some of the more controversial covert operations that the British have been involved in. I mean, can you describe some of the ways in which the UK has sort of justified some of this underhand activity and, explained why they were doing it, or even, justify both to themselves, but then also perhaps to the public or later generations of historians?
Well, yeah, the book, I tried to not pass judgments on these operations. I tried to tell the stories, uncover new stuff, and then let people make up their own minds. And some of the feedback's been great. Some people think it's absolutely outrageous that Britain's doing this kind of stuff. Other people think it's way too timid and we should be doing a lot more of it. Generally, the UK has been relatively cautious in its approach to covert action, but there have been some very controversial operations. And I'm fascinated to read how Britain, as a liberal democracy, self-justifies or moralizes these operations. One of the first ones, which is particularly controversial, was something called Operation Embarrass in 1947, 1948. And the aim here was to stem the flow of illegal immigration to Palestine. Many Jewish immigrants coming from refugee camps in places like Italy. And Britain was worried that this immigration was fueling an insurgency and launched covert operations to, for example, sabotage ships. Not with anyone on them, was not that hardcore, but sabotage and sink the ships before the refugees could get on it. Now, looking back with hindsight, so close after the horrors of the Second World War, that's a very controversial thing for Britain to have done. More recently, the controversy comes in Northern Ireland, where what seemed acceptable to many Brits inside government in places like Malaya, colonial Malaya or Aden or somewhere, suddenly we're talking about doing this stuff on the streets of the United Kingdom. And this therefore becomes really controversial. So you see them sometimes doing linguistics and ethical gymnastics to try and justify what they're doing here. Most famously, perhaps, is what critics call hit squads operating on the streets of Belfast, particularly in 1972, when we see armed plainclothes units whose entire purpose really was, to quote the Chief of General Staff at the time, to mystify, mislead and destroy terrorists. Their job was to try and draw these terrorists into the open, which would often end up in a firefight. And the justification here, because on one hand it looks very underhand, you disguise themselves as locals to try and confuse and then destroy the IRA. The justification, and people can think of this what they like, is that these were not hit squads. They would only shoot in self-defense. But it's a very fine line, because they're trying to provoke firefights. So self-defense comes very, very quickly. They're trying to draw terrorists out to the open. And what does the government think is going to happen when an armed unit draws a terrorist into the open? There's going to be a firefight. So the justification was it's only self-defense. That's slightly people can make their own mind up. The other area in Northern Ireland and beyond was black propaganda. And the question for the British is it appropriate for a liberal democracy to spread lies effectively? This is the kind of thing the Soviets do. And Britain would always justify their role in this as being defensive. We are only ever exposing the other side's lies. We're not spreading our own lies. That was the justification. But it was still very controversial to be doing black propaganda in places like Northern Ireland. One of the most famous black propaganda operations in Ireland involved a campaign to try and accuse the IRA of engaging in witchcraft and black magic to try and discredit them amongst Catholic audiences. And the Foreign Office explicitly discussed how we can justify doing this stuff in Northern Ireland, and they came up with two justifications. Again, audiences can make their own minds up. The first was that even though it's in Northern Ireland, there's still an international dimension to this, and therefore that enables Foreign Office propaganda specialists to get involved. And they linked to, they said Ireland's involved here, so it's international, and maybe clutching at straws a bit too much. They said it's also got a Vatican dimension as well. They tried to play on the Catholic Holy See angle to justify Foreign Office involvement. And the second option was emphasizing the IRA's subversive activity and communist links, which they thought justified a covert propaganda campaign. But more broadly, Britain justified a large campaign of spreading forgeries across Africa, across Southeast Asia, of creating fake groups to spread propaganda. They justified this as saying, well, all we're doing here is creating a false source, whether that is a forgery of a Soviet front organization, for example, or whether we are creating a fake African nationalist group. All we're doing is creating a false source. We're then using that false source to spread what Britain would call was the truth. And these truths were often selectively edited, but checking them out, most of them were broadly accurate. So that was justification. And they'd say, we have to create a false source because otherwise no one would believe the message. The false source makes it credible. And that was always the justification. But what we're finding, this is what I'm working on at the moment, is the nature of the fake source. Actually, to be credible means or necessitates certain tone, certain emotion, certain language, which actually encourages the audience to reinterpret the facts in a different way. I'll give you an example. When Britain created a fake think tank to discredit communism, and it was very dull, very dry, like lots of think tank reports, and people would read it and not really do much. On the other end of the scale, they forged some Muslim Brotherhood documents, And to make it credible, which in fact was, well, on one level, this is farcical. I mean, can you imagine a bunch of aging, middle-aged white men sitting in the Foreign Office writing these very, very emotive, in the name of Allah the Merciful type letters? And this is dodgy stuff here. And they are forging Muslim Brotherhood letters to try and encourage a rebellion against Nasser in Egypt, against Sukarno in Indonesia. And even though what they're saying is technically true, the way they're saying it to maintain credibility, they end up saying, for example, they criticize Nasser's policy in Yemen. Nasser had been using chemical weapons in Yemen, and Britain wanted the world to know this. So they forged a Muslim Brotherhood document written supposedly in the name of Allah the Merciful. And this document said Nasser is a non-believer. He's been using chemical weapons, and then they kind of almost get carried away and saying Nasser should have the amount of weapons that Nasser used in Yemen would have been enough to kill Israel 10 times over, or something like that, which is obviously very ethically dubious. But they justify it by saying the source was fake, but the content was true. And that distinction, I think, is a bit too simplistic.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, it begs the question, did any of these people who were sort of operating in and amongst, in the secret world, did any of them sort of wildly exceed their remit and have to, what kind of discipline structure was in place to watch what these guys were doing and to make sure that there were no sort of very public mistakes made or anything like that?
Well, interestingly, on the forgery side of things, Britain was very keen to do this, and there was one lovely document from Lebanon, I think, in the mid 60s, when the local propaganda office in Lebanon was getting a bit carried away. It was going a little bit too far, and the Foreign Office had to write to them. And there's this great British phrase of something like, "We don't want to curb your enthusiasm in this domain, but would you mind terribly just reining it in slightly?" But there are many examples of this, because one of the things that I've found, and this applies to British approach to intelligence more generally, is this all comes down from number 10 and from foreign secretaries. MI6 are not and were not rogue elephants rampaging around the world, bumping people off, doing crazy stuff without any authorization. The vast majority of this was authorized through proper bureaucratic channels. Even the more outlandish things around President Nasser in Egypt and Suez and the plans to assassinate, I mean, that still did come from the Prime Minister. So we don't see the need for much disciplinary action, because a lot of them were doing what they were told to do in the first place, quite frankly.
Can I ask you about, I mean, you've talked about some absolutely amazing operations there. I mean, was there anything, are there any spectacular failures from the British efforts in this that we should talk about? We get very used to talk about British successes and ingenuity and that sort of thing. Does anything go like spectacularly wrong?
The Operation Albania is probably the most famous of the British failures, when they supposedly wanted to detach Albania from the Soviet bloc in the late 1940s and trained up some dissidents. They infiltrated them back in by boat from Malta into Albania, and the Soviets and the Albanian authorities knew exactly what was coming, and it didn't end well, shall we say, for the poor dissidents infiltrated back in. It's very difficult to claim success, or to judge success and failure, because that's the most famous big British failure. But even after then, the British involved were desperately trying to claim it as a success. They were saying, well, we never actually wanted to detach Albania. That was always the kind of end goal. We were just trying to see if conditions were ripe for an insurrection. And it turns out conditions are not ripe for an insurrection. Therefore, we've answered our question. Therefore, we were kind of successful, which is a very brutal way of looking at it. But you can see these debates going on. There was one half failure, half success, which I thought is worth sharing because it's also quite ridiculous, which was early 1970s when in Latin America, there was a wave of kidnappings of Western diplomats by various armed leftist groups. And they ended up kidnapping the UK ambassador to Uruguay. And this caused consternation in the Foreign Office, as you'd expect. The propagandists sprung into action, started to spread disinformation, forgeries to convince the kidnappers that the local population did not approve of the kidnapping and to let the ambassador go. That failed miserably. So then they tried to do something which I've never seen before and just strikes me as slightly odd. They turned to psychics. They turned to what they called experts in extrasensory perception, psychics to you and me, to try and find out where this kidnapped ambassador was. And weirdly enough, they opened the Foreign Office address book, and it had not one, not two, but three psychics listed who could be used in this operation. The first they ruled out because apparently this particular psychic was, and I quote, not respectable. The second psychic they ruled out on the grounds that they were unwilling to share classified information with this psychic. And then they got a bit worried that the poor diplomat's wife might be distressed at the idea. They're resorting to psychics to try and find her kidnapped husband. But psychic number three, they thought might be a goer. And so they started to do a vetting process. And the recommendation for this particular psychic, interestingly enough, came from Britain's ambassador to the United Nations, who had this psychic in his address book. Ultimately, the black propaganda failed, the psychic failed, and it turned out that Ted Heath, the Prime Minister, was covertly negotiating a ransom payment to get him back. So the covert side of things failed there, and related to where it needed more discreet prime ministerial involvement. But I just when I saw those files, I just thought it was utterly bonkers.
That's absolutely fantastic. I think maybe just one final question from me, and I shall throw open to the floor because they are questions are racking up. I mean, I'm a military historian. We're joined by the military historians in the audience, and we're very used to sort of walking the ground of some of the subject matter that we cover. And I just wonder, is there an equivalent place, like a spiritual home, if you will, of British covert operations, where if you can't necessarily see the safe houses where any of this stuff happened, you can still sort of get a feel for it. I guess, well, unless it's traipsed up and down Whitehall, which is maybe less glamorous.
You say that, but I do genuinely thoroughly enjoy a little spy tour around London. It's great fun. But the best place that I like to go when thinking about these things is Berlin, which, as everyone knows, was a den of spies and covert operations on all sides during the early Cold War in particular. And just spending time soaking up the atmosphere in Berlin is really enjoyable. I mean, you don't find new things out by doing this, but it helps make sense sometimes of the skeletal record that's available in the archives. And the same goes for Washington, DC as well. DC was a big den of intrigue and spies, and it's great fun to walk those streets and see where Philby was hanging out with Angleton, etc., etc. We're all just enthusiasts at the end of the day.
Absolutely. How fantastic. Right, let's go to some of the questions which are coming up. Richard O'Shea has asked about SIS activity in Argentina in the lead up to the Falklands War, and sort of what was coming out from there, and how that was being passed back to the relevant bodies in London.
Well, there wasn't a great deal going on, as far as we know, in the lead up to the Falklands War through secret channels. Most of the good stuff coming out of Argentina was coming out through open sources and going back up to the Foreign Office with those open rather than closed channels. And the failure around intelligence and the inability to predict the start of the Falklands War came from Britain's intelligence assessment machinery, the Joint Intelligence Committee, overemphasizing the secret stuff, the weak secret stuff, at the expense of the open stuff. They made this classic intelligence mistake of assuming that top secret meant true and that declassified meant not true or boring, when actually there was a lot of really interesting and quite accurate material coming out of the Argentinian press, coming out of military attaches, those kind of semi-open sources, but Britain ignored them essentially, and that became quite costly. SIS sprung into action though once the war was underway, and there was a very dramatic operation which SIS conducted alongside French intelligence, where essentially they were tracking, and hunting down arms dealers who were selling XSF missiles to the Argentinians, and some of it got there were some quite aggressive means of dealing with those arms dealers, shall we say.
Yeah, it's not all the people always refer to John not just allowing people to bid on the open market, but then that more covert stuff that was going on as well, wasn't there? Absolutely. Graham Walker's actually asked, just going back to what you said about Berlin, about MI6's activity, obviously in 1961 when the wall was going up, about how, I guess, how much did they know, how they responded to that, what was being passed back, or were they caught, was this one of these times when the SIS were really caught on the hop by world events?
And it made a big difference to SIS's capabilities, because the free movement around Berlin prior to the war was what made Berlin such an important city, not just in intelligence gathering, but in disseminating propaganda, in trying to recruit defectors, all of these types of things. And then suddenly overnight that stops. And I think one of the consequences of that, Berlin, of course, remained an important Cold War city for intelligence terms. But from the 60s onwards, when that route is a lot less easy, we see the kind of diversification of covert action and intelligence gathering capabilities. We see things start to move towards Africa. It's more, and Southeast Asia. MI6 are looking at proxies. They're looking at the battle for post-colonial influence in Africa. They're looking at President Sukarno in Indonesia. They're even in the 1960s turning their attention quite dramatically to Latin America, a place where traditionally SIS had little role in covert action. And I think that's one of the consequences of Cold War Europe, of the war going up, is we start to see a more global approach to the Cold War, and MI6 diversifying what it's trying to do.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, James has asked a question about British attitudes towards North Korea and the Korean War of 1950 to 53. So, what was going on there, but also, after that, what you were saying about the Berlin Wall going up and forcing everything on a more global scale, are there any real sort of dead spots that remain in British intelligence capabilities, or are they managed to spread themselves pretty effectively? I
think intelligence is one of the very few areas where Britain has genuinely managed to maintain a reasonably global outlook. As Britain's global role declines and continues to decline, intelligence is one of those few areas where we have a global presence. And it's because successive governments have seen intelligence as being a force multiplier. So whereas you can retreat diplomatically or in terms of military deployment from certain theatres, if you leave behind intelligence capabilities, you get more bang for your buck, essentially. That said, Britain was never able to spread itself around the world entirely, and there are always dead spots. Latin America was never a prime target, apart from this period in the 1960s when Britain thought that American influence might be declining in Latin America, and the Latin American countries and South American countries were opening up trade-wise. There was a big MI6 drive to capitalize on that, but that was quite short-lived. Generally, Latin and South America has been more of an American field than British. And the other dead spot, and I would love if anyone knows the answer to this, I'd love to know it, was there's a great document where they're talking about American areas of influence and British areas of influence. And Britain says, and of course, we don't do any intelligence or covert operations work in Antarctica. We leave that to the US. So to answer your question, Antarctica is another dead spot for British intelligence. Although quite what the Americans are doing or did, I would love to know the answer.
That's fantastic. Ewan Grant has asked about sort of what lessons you think your research has for sort of modern day cross-agency cooperation. You know, we've been pretty terrible historians and we didn't think you could learn a lot from the past. So, I mean, what do you think, you know, looking back at the history and the legacy of some of this stuff, that, you know, what can modern day cross-agency cooperation be as the emphasis shifts from counterinsurgency to anti-terrorist work or peer and near-peer cooperation, anything like that?
I think we can draw lessons from the constant tension between different Whitehall actors during the Cold War. And Britain never quite knew how to properly coordinate, because if the Foreign Office takes charge in what technically is called a vertical approach, which excludes the Ministry of Defence, it's quicker. It's closely aligned to to foreign policy. It can be more nimble, but there's less scrutiny, and it's pretty poor interagency coordination. So the other option is what we call a horizontal approach, which involves Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence. There's better scrutiny, there's better coordination, but it's slow, it's cumbersome because you have to bring in more Whitehall actors. And that tension is really relevant today. And this, I think, is where the National Security Council, set up in 2010, is really good, because it coordinates, it kind of combines those two approaches quite neatly. It solves that riddle which plagued British covert action for a good 20-30 years, because the NSC, it provides a forum for scrutiny and accountability and coordination, but at the same time, covert operations which can just go up through the Foreign Office do just go up through the Foreign Office. And it gets that balance right, I think, between scrutiny and coordination versus speed, nimbleness and policy integration. So I think that how we manage that is one lesson. I think another lesson is about how we should approach covert operations in a liberal democracy, and how we justify some of these things. And I think when we are talking about countering Russian disinformation, a lot of the debate, for obvious reasons, focuses on exposing that disinformation, focuses on how we can increase the public's ability to spot disinformation. The debate does not focus on British covert responses. Now, history tells us that Britain will at least be debating the prospect of covert operations to counter Russian disinformation. And what we can learn from history includes, well, under what conditions should Britain be doing this? And what are some of the consequences and impacts of Britain doing this? Because history tells us that covert propaganda, for example, is much more complex than just something which has to stay secret and which changes minds. That's almost a received wisdom of what covert propaganda should look like. But history tells us, well, actually, exposure can counterintuitively have benefits. Even if the propaganda never reaches the intended audience, it can tie down your adversary's intelligence services as they try to work out who is behind it. If the adversary denounces something as a forgery, that can actually sometimes be more useful than if they didn't, because that denunciation ends up reaching more people than the original forgery would have done. So I think looking at the history shows us, or breaks down, consequences of covert action in quite a nuanced and sophisticated way. Many of these trade-offs, many of these impacts, consequences are still relevant today. And I think it's really important to demythologize covert action, to think about, to treat it almost like any other form of policy, so that we can unpack how it works, how it's authorized, trade-offs, what happens. There's a danger if we just mythologize it as James Bond stuff, then you miss a lot of this really important nuance.
Fantastic. I think maybe just from the final question, and Francesca's asked a little bit about, and it sort of brings us back to the very beginning when we were talking about sources. And Francesca's asked about UK archives intelligence records and the chances that more may be made available in future, or if things are actually going to start being closed for longer and things actually becoming more, less accessible. And perhaps, what you feel as a historian in the field, what you think the future landscape of the field might be.
Well, they're obviously moving the 30-year rule to a 20-year rule, which is great. On the downside, a lot of the intelligence material is outside of those changes. And one thing I've noticed is that the freedom of information request system seems to be getting a lot worse over the last 5 or so years. And I don't know if this is because of cuts in Whitehall. I don't know if it's anything ideological. I'm not going to offer any conspiracies, but this is problematic for intelligence historians. I've got some really good stuff through FOIs for this book around something called the Joint Action Committee, which sounds terribly boring, but it was Britain's body to coordinate covert action, the big covert actions. And that was all classified. I got some great stuff through FOI. I got some other great stuff through FOI about Middle Eastern operations. Unfortunately, it's just dried up. And I've had no successes for at least 3 years. So I think that's the trend that I've noticed. And I don't see it getting any better for as long as government are making severe cuts across the board. Right,
fantastic. I think sadly we've just about run out of time there. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us and talking about so many wonderful and varied things. I think this idea about the forgeries of the Muslim Brotherhood and the psychics will certainly stay with me for quite a long time. That was absolutely brilliant. For those of you again who joined us a little bit late and want to watch back, there will be a replay available pretty much immediately via the same link. Also, please do look at this green bar underneath me here, which will allow you to get 30 off Rory's book. We've only absolutely scratched the surface of some of the amazing stuff that's in there, and you can get far more out of there. But by all means, please do follow through. Use that code; you'll get 30% off. So that really is a bargain on a rather soggy Friday. And likewise, again on a soggy Friday afternoon, if you're looking for something to do catch a documentary that feature over the weekend too. It's available on Channel 4, all about Iran and some of the coup there, which is absolutely brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause for Rory for joining us. It's been absolutely fantastic. Join me also as well as giving a virtual round of applause to my colleagues Nicola and Isabel, who continue to do so much amazing stuff in the background of all of this and keeping everything ticking over and keeping everything good. I just get to stand up here and talk about stuff that I find really interesting, but they're the guys who do all the legwork. So let's give them a thanks. Without them, none of this stuff would be happening. So thank you to them. Really hope you guys can join us next week. Please do look ahead for what we've got in the rest of the program. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Rory. Thank you everybody for joining us. Hope you guys stay safe and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.